What would you do if your own father called you a stranger in his house for 29 years? What if the man who was supposed to protect you turned your existence into an accusation against your mother? And what if the DNA test he demanded didn't just prove him wrong, but uncovered a secret so devastating it brought him to his knees in front of 65 relatives? My name is Megan Ashford. I'm 29 years old. I have blonde hair, blue eyes, and fair skin. In a family where everyone, my father Richard, my mother Catherine, my older brother Ethan, every aunt, uncle, and cousin, has dark brown hair and brown eyes, I've always been the one who didn't match. And my father never let me forget it. Richard Ashford was a successful engineer who built a 6-bedroom Tudor mansion in Greenwich, Connecticut, with, as he loved to remind us, his own 2 hands. He was brilliant, wealthy, respected in the community, and absolutely convinced that his wife had betrayed him the year I was born. My mother, Kate, was the opposite of everything Richard accused her of being. She was quiet, loyal, devoted. She polished the Wedgwood china every Sunday, as if perfection could somehow shield her from his words. My brother Ethan, 3 years older, was the golden child, the one Richard claimed with pride. And then there was my grandmother, Vivian Whitfield, 80 years old, with the posture of a queen and eyes that missed nothing. She never trusted Richard, not from the beginning. Now let me take you to the night everything finally broke. It was a Sunday dinner. The chandelier cast a warm golden light across the oak table. The air smelled like rosemary roast and silence. My mother sat clutching her linen napkin. My grandmother watched my father, the way a hawk watches a snake. And then Richard cleared his throat. He reached into his jacket and slid a folded document across the table toward me. It was a DNA paternity consent form, his signature already at the bottom. "I won't be at your wedding, Megan," he said, his voice calm, almost rehearsed. "Not until we settle this. You have 6 weeks. Take the test. Share the results with the family. If you're mine, I'll apologize. But we both know what it's going to show." Then he turned to Ethan and said something that made my mother's fork clatter against her plate. "You, son, you're the only proof your mother ever knew what loyalty means." My grandmother set her teacup down so hard the saucer cracked. But I didn't flinch. I didn't sign the paper. I didn't storm out. I looked straight at him and said, "Thank you for the reminder, Richard. I'll remember this." And I meant every word, because by 29, his cruelty was nothing new. I was 7 the first time I understood I was different. I pressed my ear against my parents' bedroom door and heard him call my mother a name no wife should ever hear. "Look at that blonde hair," he spat. "Where did it come from, Catherine? Certainly not from me." At 12, I wanted to join the volleyball team. Richard refused to sign the permission slip. "I'm not investing in someone else's kid," he told me, right in front of Ethan, who got brand new baseball cleats that same week. At 16, on Christmas morning, while everyone else opened gifts by the tree, Richard pulled me into the kitchen corner and whispered, "You're not in my will. Never have been." I looked at the Christmas tree through blurry eyes and said nothing. At 18, Ethan went off to college. Richard paid every cent: tuition, housing, meals, spending money. When I got accepted to nursing school, he looked at me across that same dining table and said, "Your real father can pay for that." So I took out $67,000 in loans. I worked double shifts at a diner 6 days a week. I graduated 6 years later with a degree I earned entirely on my own. But the money wasn't the worst part. The worst part was watching what his accusations did to my mother. Every argument between them, every disagreement about bills or vacations or Ethan's career, always circled back to me. I was his weapon, his evidence, his never-ending reminder of a betrayal that never happened. The night before I left for college, my grandmother Vivian gripped my wrist and said something I didn't understand at the time. "Keep every document from the hospital where you were born, your birth certificate, any paperwork. I have a feeling we're going to need them someday." I didn't ask why. I just kept the papers. And 18 years later, I finally learned why she told me to. That night, I drove back to my apartment in Stamford, a small one-bedroom I'd furnished with second-hand pieces and pure stubbornness. Daniel was waiting on the couch, his laptop open to floor plans for a client, 2 glasses of wine poured on the coffee table. Cheap glasses from Target, nothing like the Waterford crystal my father drank from. 2 different worlds, separated by more than money. Daniel knew something was wrong the moment I walked in. "What did he do this time?" he asked. I told him everything. The DNA form, the ultimatum, the 6-week deadline. His jaw tightened with every word. When I finished, he set down his glass and said, "Maybe you should just do it. Take the test, prove him wrong once and for all, and shut him up forever." But I shook my head. It wasn't about proving Richard wrong anymore. It was about freeing my mother. And to understand why, I need to take you back 5 years. It was 2 in the morning when my phone rang. My grandmother's voice on the other end, shaking in a way I'd never heard before. "Come to the house, now, it's your mother." Vivian had found Kate in the bathroom with an empty bottle of sleeping pills. The paramedics arrived just in time. Just barely. After that night, my mother started taking medication for depression. She saw a therapist twice a week. She rebuilt herself piece by piece, slowly, painfully, and Richard never once acknowledged what 24 years of his accusations had done to her. He never apologized, he just kept insisting he was right. So when I picked up my phone that night in my apartment, I wasn't doing this for myself. I pulled up a genetics lab I'd been researching for months. Biogenics Labs. Independent, certified, and most importantly, not connected to Richard in any way. "I'll take the test," I told Daniel, "but I'll do it my way." 2 weeks later, Richard turned 60. The party was held at the Greenwich Harbor Club, a private dining room with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Long Island Sound. 35 relatives gathered to celebrate the man who had turned my mother's life into a prison. I wore a simple black dress. Daniel squeezed my hand as we walked in and whispered, "2 hours. We can survive 2 hours." We couldn't. Halfway through dinner, after 3 glasses of expensive wine, Richard stood up to give a speech. He thanked everyone for coming. He praised Ethan for his brilliant career in finance. He raised a glass to my mother for her patience. And then his eyes found me. "I see my daughter is here tonight," he said, and the word daughter dripped with sarcasm. A few relatives shifted uncomfortably. Then he smiled. That cold, calculated smile I'd seen 1,000 times, and said, "You know what they call a bird that lays its eggs in another bird's nest? A cuckoo. The cuckoo's egg looks beautiful, doesn't it? But it doesn't belong. It never did." An aunt gasped. A cousin let out a nervous laugh. My mother stared at her lap, tears falling silently onto the bracelet Richard had given her after one of their worst fights. A guilt gift she wore like a chain. My knuckles went white around my fork. Every muscle in my body screamed at me to stand up and say something I could never take back. But I didn't. I set the fork down, took a breath, and stood. "Thank you for the reminder, Richard," I said, my voice steady. Then I turned to my mother. "Mom, let's get some air." She took my hand, and together we walked out of that room. Past the whispers, past the stares, past the man who had spent 29 years trying to destroy us both. My grandmother caught up with us in the parking lot, her heels clicking against the asphalt like gunshots. "Megan, wait." I turned. Vivian Whitfield was 80 years old, but she moved with a purpose that made her seem decades younger. She looked back to make sure Richard hadn't followed, and then she said something that changed everything. "There's something I should have told you years ago. The night you were born at St. Andrew's Medical Center, something strange happened." She told us that when the nurse brought me out to show her, and my grandfather, the woman looked terrified. Her hands were shaking. She handed me to my mother too quickly, then practically ran out of the room. My mother stiffened beside me. "Mom," Kate whispered, "you never told me this." "I tried to investigate," Vivian said. "I called the hospital, asked questions. They stonewalled me. Your father, God rest his soul, even hired a private investigator. But the hospital threatened to countersue, and he backed down. I never did." Then she reached into her purse and pulled out a yellowed piece of paper. A copy of my birth record she'd made before the hospital locked everything down. I looked at it. Time of birth, 11:47 p.m. "I gave birth at 11:58, my mother said slowly. I remember staring at the clock because the contractions were so intense. The doctor even joked that I almost had a leap day baby. 11:47, 11:58, 11 minutes apart. Something had happened in those 11 minutes. There's a name, my grandmother said quietly. The head nurse that night. Dorothy Brennan. She retired 10 years ago. Vivian looked at me with an urgency I had never seen in her face before. And I have her address. The night air was cold, but I barely felt it. All I could feel was the pounding of my heart and the weight of a question that had been waiting 29 years to be asked. 11 minutes. Just 11 minutes had changed two families forever, and the woman who had kept that secret for nearly 3 decades was about to face the one person who would never stop looking for the truth. The next morning, I walked into Biogenics Labs in Hartford with 3 DNA samples. Mine was simple, a cheek swab sealed in a sterile tube. My mother's was voluntary. She had given it to me the night before with red eyes but steady hands. Whatever this shows, she said quietly, you are my daughter. Nothing changes that. The third sample was stolen. A few strands of hair pulled from the brush Richard kept in the guest bathroom, the one I had used every Thanksgiving and Christmas for years, pretending I didn't notice the way he flinched whenever I reached past him for the soap. The technician explained the process. Results in 3 weeks. Legally admissible, completely confidential. I paid extra for expedited processing. My grandmother insisted on covering the cost. That afternoon, I tried calling Dorothy Brennan. The phone rang 6 times before a trembling voice picked up. Hello, Mrs. Brennan. My name is Megan Ashford. I was born at St. Andrew's Medical Center on March 15, 1996. I believe you were the head nurse that night, and I just need to ask you a few questions. I can't help you. The words came fast, panicked, breathless. Please don't contact me again. And she hung up. I stared at my phone for a long time. An innocent woman would have been confused. Dorothy Brennan was terrified. Whatever happened that night, she had been carrying it for 29 years. 3 days later, Richard made his next move. He sent an email to our entire extended family. 52 recipients, aunts, uncles, cousins, second cousins, people I hadn't spoken to since childhood. My mother, my grandmother, and I were all copied. The subject line read, regarding Megan's wedding. I read it parked outside the hospital where I worked, my hands shaking against the steering wheel. In it, Richard wrote that he had carried a burden for 29 years, that he had endured doubt about his daughter's true parentage, and that my refusal to take the test spoke for itself. Attached was a photograph from my christening. Me at 3 months old, blonde hair, blue eyes, cradled in my mother's arms, surrounded by a sea of brunettes. Richard had circled my face in red and added a caption, "Spot the difference." Within hours, the responses started flooding in. Some defended my mother. Most just asked careful, probing questions, curious about the drama. One aunt forwarded the email directly to me with a single line. "Would you like to explain?" Ethan called that night. "Just do what Dad wants," he said, his voice tight. "You're ruining his reputation." I actually laughed. His reputation? That's what you're worried about? He hung up without answering. 3 weeks later, the results arrived. It was a Tuesday night, 9:47 p.m. Daniel was traveling for work, a project consultation in Boston. I was alone in our apartment, a half-eaten salad on the coffee table, my laptop open to a show I hadn't been watching. The subject line was clinical. Your DNA analysis results. Secure document. I entered my password. I verified my identity. I opened the file, and then I read it 3 times, because the first 2 times the words didn't make sense. Subject A, Megan Ashford, shows 0% genetic match, with Subject B, Richard Ashford. I had expected that. I had braced myself for it. But then came the second line. Subject A, Megan Ashford, shows 0% genetic match with Subject C, Catherine Ashford. 0%. Not my father's daughter. Not my mother's daughter. I stopped breathing. I called Biogenics' after-hours line, my voice cracking as I begged to speak with someone who could explain. A technician walked me through everything. No contamination, no lab error, no possibility of a mistake. The science was absolute. I was not biologically related to either of my parents, which meant my mother had never been unfaithful. Richard had been wrong about that for 29 years. But it also meant something I never could have imagined. If Catherine Ashford didn't have an affair, if she had been faithful every single day of her marriage, then how was I not her daughter? I sat on my kitchen floor with my back against the cabinet, staring at the ceiling, my phone resting in my lap. For 29 years, my father called my mother a liar. For 29 years, he was wrong about the affair. But he was right about one thing: I wasn't his. The question that echoed through my empty apartment was simple and terrifying. Whose daughter was I? I drove to my parents' house the next morning, timing my arrival for 10 a.m., late enough that Richard would be at his golf game, early enough that my mother would still be in her robe, drinking Earl Grey in the sunroom. She looked up when I walked in. "Megan, what's wrong?" I sat across from her and handed her my phone with the biogenics report on the screen. I watched her read it. I watched the color leave her face. I watched her lips move silently as she read the numbers again and again. When she finally looked up, her eyes were wild with something between terror and disbelief. "This is wrong," she whispered. "This has to be wrong. I called the lab, triple-checked everything. There's no mistake, Mom. But I gave birth to you." Her voice rose, cracking at the edges. "I was in labor for 16 hours. I felt you leave my body. I saw you, Megan. You were red and screaming and mine." I took her hands. They were ice cold. "I believe you," I said, "which means there's only one explanation. Something happened at the hospital. Someone switched us." The silence between us stretched like a wire about to snap. Then my mother whispered, "The time." "The birth certificate says 11:47, but I remember watching the clock. You were born at 11:58. She stood suddenly and ran upstairs. I heard drawers opening, boxes being moved. When she came back down, she was holding a yellowed hospital wristband. "Baby girl Ashford," she read aloud, her fingers trembling. 11:47 p.m. She looked at me with tears streaming down her face. I always wondered why the time was wrong. Now I know. I held her as she cried, and then I said the words neither of us was ready to hear. "Mom, if I'm not your biological daughter, that means your real daughter is out there somewhere, 29 years old, living someone else's life." Before we could process what that meant, my phone rang. It was Ethan, and the news he delivered turned everything upside down again. Richard had seen the biogenics confirmation on my mother's phone while Ethan was visiting for lunch. Within the hour, Richard called me, his voice trembling with a joy that made my stomach turn. "So," he said, before I could even speak. "What did it say? Was I right?" My silence told him everything. "I knew it." He laughed. Actually laughed. A sound of pure, ugly vindication. 29 years, Megan. Nobody believed me. But I was right. I was right all along. Richard, you don't understand what the results actually show. I understand perfectly. You're not my daughter. Your mother lied to me for nearly 3 decades. And now everyone is going to know exactly what kind of woman Catherine Ashford really is. He hung up before I could explain that Catherine hadn't lied, that she had been telling the truth all along, that the real story was something none of us had ever imagined. Within the hour, he called my mother and told her to pack her bags. "I want you out of my house by the end of the month," he said. "I'm done with your lies." My grandmother drove over immediately. When I arrived that evening, I found them in the living room. My mother curled into the couch, trembling. My grandmother standing watch like a silver-haired sentinel. "He thinks he's won," I said quietly. My grandmother looked at me with those sharp, knowing eyes, and said, "Then let's show him the rest of the story." Over the next 3 days, I called Dorothy Brennan 6 times. Each call went straight to voicemail. On the 6th try, I left a different kind of message. "Mrs. Brennan, my name is Megan Ashford. I know you remember that name. I have certified, legally admissible DNA evidence that proves a baby was switched at St. Andrew's Medical Center on March 15, 1996. I'm not looking to blame you. I'm not looking to sue. I just need to know who I am." I paused, steadied my breath, and continued. "If you don't call me back, my next call will be to a lawyer. I'll subpoena the hospital records. I'll file a formal investigation. And whatever you've been hiding for 29 years will come out in the worst possible way. 1 hour passed. Then 2. At 4:17 p.m., my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Thursday, 2 p.m., Harborside Diner, Norwalk. Come alone. Harborside Diner was the kind of place time forgot. Vinyl booths patched with duct tape, a jukebox that only played oldies, and coffee that had probably been sitting since the last century. Dorothy Brennan sat in the corner booth with her back to the wall. She was 74, smaller than I had imagined, with silver hair pulled into a tight bun and hands that trembled against her coffee cup. When I slid into the seat across from her, she looked up and said something that made my heart stop. "You look just like her. Karen, your biological mother. Same hair, same eyes, same everything." I could barely get the words out. "You know who my biological mother is." Dorothy closed her eyes for a long moment. When she opened them, they were wet. "I've carried this for 29 years, she said. "Every single day, wondering if I did the right thing by staying quiet." She reached into her purse and pulled out a worn leather journal, its pages yellowed with age. "This is my shift log from March 15th, 1996, the night you were born." She opened it to a flagged page and slid it across the table. I read her cramped handwriting, and my blood ran cold with every line. 11:47 p.m., baby girl number 1, born to Catherine Ashford. Healthy, 7 pounds 2 ounces. 11:58 p.m., baby girl number 2, born to Karen Hayes. Healthy, 6 pounds 4 ounces. 12:32 a.m., incident. Trainee nurse Jenny Wells mixed up infants after bathing. Error realized at 2:15 a.m. Both families had already bonded. 2:45 a.m., meeting with hospital administrator. Decision made to correct records, not families. Non-disclosure agreement required for all staff present. I looked up at Dorothy, my hands shaking. "They knew," I whispered. "They knew that night. And they covered it up." "The administrator said it would cause more harm to switch you back," Dorothy said, her voice breaking. Both mothers had already held their babies, fed them, named them. I was 24 years old. They threatened my nursing license. They threatened my pension. They made me sign a non-disclosure agreement. I had 2 children of my own to feed. She paused, staring into her coffee cup. In 2005, I couldn't take it anymore. I sent an anonymous letter to the hospital board, demanding they come forward. 2 days later, a lawyer showed up at my front door. They reminded me what I had signed. They reminded me what I stood to lose. Her hands shook harder. So I stayed quiet. For 20 more years, I stayed quiet. Then she pulled out one more piece of paper, a printout from a social media profile. A woman my age with chestnut brown hair and warm brown eyes, a strong jawline, and a smile that looked exactly like my brother Ethan's. "Her name is Sophia Hayes," Dorothy said. "She's 29 years old. She lives in Worcester, Massachusetts. She's an elementary school teacher." Dorothy looked at me with eyes full of decades of guilt. "And she is your mother's biological daughter." I stared at the photograph of Sophia Hayes, this stranger who carried my mother's blood, who had my brother's jaw, and my father's eyes. The daughter my mother should have been holding for the last 29 years, and in that moment, sitting in a crumbling diner in Norwalk, I knew the fight wasn't over. It was just beginning. That night, I sat in my apartment staring at Sophia Hayes' LinkedIn profile. Elementary school teacher in Worcester, graduate of UConn. Her profile picture showed a woman with chestnut brown hair and warm brown eyes, standing in front of a colorful classroom. She looked exactly like what Ethan might have looked like if he had been born a woman. I composed the message 17 times before hitting send. I explained the DNA test, the 0% match, the nurse's confession, and told her I believed she was the biological daughter of Richard and Catherine Ashford. 24 hours later, Sophia blocked me. She thought it was a scam. I called Dorothy, who contacted Sophia directly and confirmed everything was real. The next evening, my phone rang. "Is this Megan?" The voice was shaky but somehow familiar. "My whole life, people told me I don't look like my parents," Sophia said. "My dad used to joke that maybe the hospital made a mistake. We all laughed." She let out a sound, half laugh, half sob. "I guess it wasn't a joke." We talked for 3 hours. We agreed on another DNA test comparing Sophia to Richard and Catherine. 10 days later, the results confirmed it. 99.97% match with Richard, 99.98% with Catherine. We met at a coffee shop halfway between Stamford and Worcester. When she saw me, she stood so fast her chair nearly fell. We just stared. She had the Ashford jawline, Richard's dimple. I had blonde hair and blue eyes matching Karen Hayes's photos. Then we were hugging in the middle of the shop, crying, while the baristas looked away. "I want to meet them," Sophia said. "Catherine and Richard." "You will," I promised. "In 3 days." Over those 3 days, I prepared like a prosecutor. Biogenics reports, Dorothy's notarized shift log, her signed witness statement, Sophia's DNA results. My grandmother would be in the room. Dorothy in the corner, Sophia behind a connecting door. Daniel asked, "Are you sure? There's no taking this back." I thought about the sleeping pills, about 29 years of accusations. He sent that email to 52 people. He called me a cuckoo's egg in front of the whole family. He doesn't get to disappear quietly. The engagement party was held at Whitfield Manor. 65 guests in cocktail attire, beneath fairy lights and century-old oaks. Every person who received Richard's email was there. My mother arrived with Vivian, her posture straighter than I had seen in years. Then Richard walked in. Late, tailored suit, watch catching the light. Smirking like a man about to collect a debt, he worked the room, accepting sympathy. "You've been so patient," an aunt murmured. He had no idea what was coming. Halfway through cocktails, Richard took the microphone. He congratulated Daniel for being brave enough to marry into this complicated family. Then his eyes found mine. I asked Megan to take a DNA test. She did, and she's been hiding the results. He pulled out Ethan's copy of my report and read it aloud. 0% Richard Ashford. 0% Catherine Ashford. Gasps filled the room. 29 years, Richard said, his voice rising. "I told everyone something wasn't right. Now science proves it." He turned to my mother. "You lied to me, Catherine, and now everyone knows what kind of woman you really are." Silence. Then I walked to the stage. "You're right, Richard." I took the microphone. He was too stunned to stop me. "I'm not your biological daughter, and I'm not Mom's either, but not because she had an affair." His smirk died. He lunged for the microphone. Daniel stepped between us, looked Richard in the eye without a word. Richard backed off. I faced the crowd. "Let me introduce you to someone." I nodded toward the side door. Sophia stepped through, brown hair, brown eyes, unmistakably Ashford. A champagne glass shattered. Ethan choked. "This is Sophia Hayes, born 11 minutes before me at St. Andrew's Medical Center." That night, a trainee nurse switched 2 babies. The hospital discovered it within hours and covered it up. The screen lit up with biogenics results. Sophia's DNA, 99.97%. Richard, 99.98%. Catherine, "She is your biological daughter, Richard. She's been in Massachusetts her entire life, because a hospital chose silence over truth." Dorothy rose from her corner. "Mr. Ashford, I was there. Your wife never betrayed you. Never. They threatened our jobs, our pensions. I'm sorry I didn't speak sooner." Richard's face went white. His knees buckled. He caught himself on one knee, palms slapping hardwood, chest heaving. "I didn't know." "How could I have known? You could have trusted her," I said. "Instead, you chose cruelty." For 29 years, Ethan stood. I expected him to defend his father. Instead, he walked past Richard without a glance and crossed to our mother. "Mom, I'm sorry. I should have spoken up years ago." Catherine pulled him close. Richard watched his family choose each other over him. Then my mother stepped forward. The room parted. She stopped in front of Richard, still on one knee. 29 years, Richard. I stayed because I loved you. I needed you to believe me, and you never did." She turned to Sophia. "Hello. I'm your mother. I'm so sorry it took so long to find you." Richard struggled to his feet alone. No one helped. His voice came out broken, unrecognizable. "I was wrong. Catherine never betrayed me. I accused her for nearly 3 decades, and I was wrong." He looked at me. "Megan, I took things I can never give back. Your childhood, your trust. I'll repay your student loans. All 67,000. It's not enough, but it's a start. He turned to Sophia. You're my daughter, and I've missed everything. I'll regret that until I die. Sophia's voice was steady through tears. We can start now, if you're willing to be a father instead of a judge. My grandmother handed him a tissue. Clean yourself up, Richard. You have a lot of work ahead of you. He had knelt before 65 witnesses, broken by the same science he once demanded. But my story wasn't finished. Because in Worcester, there was a woman with blonde hair and blue eyes who had carried me for 9 months and never known the difference. 1 week after the engagement party, I drove to Worcester, Massachusetts. Karen Hayes answered the door before I could knock. She was 57, with blonde hair streaked with silver, and blue eyes that were an exact mirror of my own. Looking at her was like looking into a time machine. Megan. Her voice caught on my name. She pulled me into a hug that smelled like lavender, and something that felt impossibly like home. We sat in her kitchen for 4 hours. She told me about Robert, my biological father, who had lost his battle with cancer 3 years earlier, never knowing Sophia wasn't his. Robert used to say Sophia had old soul eyes, Karen said, wiping her tears. Now I understand. They were your eyes, Megan. They were always your eyes. Then she brought out a small wooden music box, its finish worn smooth by years of handling. Robert bought this the day you were born. He wound it up every night for Sophia, but she never seemed to care for it, maybe because it was never meant for her. I lifted the lid, and a gentle melody filled the kitchen. I closed my eyes and let the tears come. A lullaby from a father I would never meet, meant for a daughter he never got to hold. I don't want to replace Catherine, Karen said. She raised you. She's your mother. She is, I agreed. But maybe there's room for one more. 2 months later, I married Daniel Porter, in the rose garden of Whitfield Manor. My mother Catherine walked me down the aisle, not Richard. She wore a champagne-colored dress and held her head high, her steps steadier than I had seen in decades. I wore a gown she and my grandmother had insisted on buying. A proper dress for a proper wedding, Vivian had declared. Sophia stood with my bridesmaids. Karen sat in the front row, a place of honor. Richard sat in the second row, quiet and diminished. When I had told him he wouldn't be walking me down the aisle, he just nodded and said, I understand. It was the first time in 29 years those words had sounded true. My grandmother raised her glass. To truth, she said. However long it takes. To truth, the room echoed. The lawsuit took 8 months. Sophia and I filed jointly against St. Andrews. Dorothy testified with full immunity. During discovery, internal documents proved the hospital had known all along. Emails between administrators, risk memos, and a budget line labeled potential liability settlement, renewed every year since 1996. 29 years of silence, funded and filed away. The hospital settled, $480,000 to each family, a public apology, mandatory improvements to newborn identification, and the forced resignation of the administrator, who ordered the cover-up. Dorothy sent me a card afterward. Thank you for giving me a reason to finally tell the truth. I can sleep now. I kept it beside my real birth certificate, the one that said 11:58 p.m. 6 months later, Richard invited me to a quiet Italian restaurant in Stamford. He looked older, grayer, smaller. He told me he was in therapy, that he and Catherine were in couples counseling, separated but trying. I remember when you taught me to ride a bike, I said. I was 5. Before you decided I wasn't yours, you held the seat and ran beside me for an hour. His eyes filled with tears. I remember, he whispered. That's the father I needed, I said. The one who held on. Forgiveness is a process, not an event. And you have a lot of work to do. Sophia and Ethan discovered they were both allergic to shellfish, both left-handed, both despised cilantro, and both loved the same obscure indie band nobody else had heard of. When Ethan said, "You're like a mirror, but a girl version," Sophia threw a bread roll at him, and for the first time, an Ashford family dinner had real laughter. Catherine and Karen now meet monthly. They trade stories about daughters they raised, but didn't birth. They call each other the other mother. I'm sitting in our new apartment now. The walls are covered with photographs from both families. Daniel is in the kitchen making something complicated. On the coffee table, between baby name books and a pregnancy journal, is the test I took this morning. Positive. For 29 years, I tried to be an Ashford. I straightened my hair darker. I learned golf because Richard loved golf. I chose nursing over art because it felt practical, not something a cuckoo's egg would choose. I spent my whole life fitting into a shape that was never meant for me. Now I know. DNA does not make a family. The woman who held my hand during nightmares, who taught me to read, who stayed in a marriage destroying her just to keep us together, that is my mother, not biology. Love. I don't know whose DNA this baby will carry, but I know one thing. This child will be loved from the very first moment, without condition, without doubt. That is the only proof that matters. Trust is a choice. Doubt is easy. But 29 years of doubt nearly destroyed my family. 29 years of trust could have saved it. Thank you for listening to my story.